The morning light spilled through the gauzy curtains of the Whitaker family home, casting a warm glow on the heirloom-filled living room. But the light did little to soften the atmosphere when Mrs. Whitaker, the formidable matriarch, made her grand entrance. Her footsteps were a metronome of authority, each click on the hardwood floor a reminder of her presence. I remember that morning vividly. The tension was like a thick fog in the room. I had been married to Alex for just over a year, but the house still felt like foreign territory, with Mrs. Whitaker as the unchallenged ruler. Tradition, Ella, she would say, her voice resonating with a timbre that seemed to echo off the walls, is what keeps a family strong. It's what has upheld the Whitaker name for generations. But don't you think, Mrs. Whitaker, I ventured, my voice steady despite the flutter in my chest, that sometimes traditions can be evolved? To keep the family not just strong but happy? She turned to me, her eyes like flint. Evolving traditions, you say? What's next, abandoning them altogether? Where would we be then, I ask you? Alex watched from the doorway, his eyes darting between his mother and me, a silent plea for peace etched into his furrowed brow. Mother, Ella has a point. Maybe we can find a middle ground, Alex started, his voice a mix of deference and desperation. A middle ground, Mrs. Whitaker interrupted, her gaze now fixed on her son, is a precarious place to stand, Alexander. It often leads to a fall. I stood up, feeling the weight of her disapproval. I respect your ways, Mrs. Whitaker, I said, my resolve hardening. But I must also respect my own beliefs. I will not quit my job at the library. It's important to me, as are the book club meetings. The library job is one thing, she countered, her voice rising, but those meetings, nothing but a pointless congregation of gossiping women. They're more than that, I insisted. We share stories, support each other. It's a community. Mrs. Whitaker's lips thinned into a line. Community is here, with your family, not with strangers over books and tea. The room went silent, the air thick with unspoken ultimatums. Alex's plea was silent, but it hung between us, a desperate bridge over troubled waters. Fine, she spat out, the words slicing through the quiet. If you won't listen to reason, you'll learn through consequence. You leave me no choice, Ella. I hadn't realized then what she meant by consequence. I couldn't have imagined that, for my defiance, I would be met with such an archaic punishment. It was only later that day, when Alex had left for his trip and the house had quieted, that I would discover how unyielding Mrs. Whitaker could truly be. The consequence was waiting for me in the shadows of the basement, where tradition took on a darker meaning, and my spirit was to be tested against the cold embrace of solitude. The basement was a forgotten chamber, a place where discarded memories mingled with the mustiness of neglect. As the key turned in the lock, sealing my fate, I could hear the echo of Mrs. Whitaker's footsteps retreating, each step a chisel chipping away at the notion of familial warmth I had once held dear. The room was shrouded in darkness, save for the sliver of light that fought its way through a small, grime-coated window high up on the wall. The air was cool and damp, a stark contrast to the false comfort above. I found myself enveloped in shadows that seemed to pulse with silent judgment. Let's see if solitude can adjust your perspective, Ella. Mrs. Whitaker's voice drifted down the stairs, a taunting specter at the doorway. I wrapped my arms around myself, seeking solace in the embrace of my own determination. You can lock me away, but you can't lock away my beliefs, I whispered to the darkness, a defiant tear tracing a cold path down my cheek. Time became an elusive creature in the blackness of the basement. Without the sun to mark its passage, minutes stretched into hours, and hours could have been days. I found a box to sit on, its contents unknown, its surface a cold reminder of my confinement. Ella? The voice was faint, a whisper through the floorboards. It was Alex, a tone of worry threading his words. Are you down there? I rose to my feet, moving toward the sound of his voice. Yes, Alex, I'm here, I called out, my voice steady. What? What happened? Why are you? His questions hung in the air, unfinished but clear in their intent. Your mother, I said, the words tasting bitter. She didn't approve of, well, me. There was silence, and in that void, I could feel the battle within him, the son versus the husband. "I'll talk to her, Ella." "This is madness," Alex finally said, though the conviction in his voice waned, as if diluted by the weight of his mother's authority. "Don't," I replied, a surprising calm in my voice. "This is something I need to face on my own. Just take care of yourself, Alex." Footsteps retreated, and once again, I was alone with the dark. The night was filled with the sound of my own heart, the quiet reassurance that it still beat strong, despite the chill of my surroundings. As hours melded into the fabric of the night, I drew upon the stories I loved from the library, imagining the voices of countless characters who had faced greater darknesses than mine. They whispered courage, spoke of resilience, and painted my thoughts with vivid tales of triumph. The darkness of the basement was absolute, but within me, there was a light that no lock could contain, a flame that grew with each remembered story of hope and defiance. This was the room where I was supposed to learn subservience, but instead, I was learning the true strength of my own spirit. The third day dawned, or so I assumed, for in the basement, dawn was just a concept. My body ached from the cold hardness of the floor where I had finally succumbed to exhaustion. I was roused by the faint sound of a car engine, which ceased abruptly, followed by the unmistakable cadence of my father's footsteps. I knew that walk, a march tempered by years of military discipline. "Ella?" His voice was a baritone rumble, barely audible through the thick wooden door of the basement. "Dad?" I called out, my voice a mixture of relief and desperation. "I'm here, I'm down here." The sound of footsteps approached the basement door, and the ensuing silence was laden with tension. Mrs. Whitaker's voice sliced through the stillness. "She's down there, Richard. Learning a lesson about respect and obedience." I heard my father's reply, his tone icy with controlled anger. "Maureen, you and I have very different ideas about respect." The lock gave way with a forceful turn, and light spilled into the room, casting away the shadows. Blinking against the sudden brightness, I could just make out my father's figure framed in the doorway. He descended the steps, his eyes softening as they met mine. "Ella," he said, extending a hand, "let's get you out of here." I reached out, grasping his hand. "Dad, I'm sorry you had to." He cut me off with a shake of his head. "No child of mine apologizes for being wronged." We ascended the stairs together, emerging into the kitchen where Mrs. Whitaker stood, her face a mask of indignation. "Richard, this is family business. Ella needs to learn." My father faced her, his posture rigid with military bearing. "No, Maureen. What Ella needs is to be treated with dignity. Not to be locked away like a disobedient pet. I won't stand for it." The air was thick with the unsaid, with history and conflict, but in that moment, my father's presence was a fortress. Mrs. Whitaker's eyes flickered with something I had never seen before, doubt. "But our family." "Family doesn't imprison family," my father interrupted firmly. "And they certainly don't break each other down. You've overstepped, and this ends now." His declaration was a gavel's fall, a decree that echoed in the silence that followed. "Richard, Mrs. Whitaker began, but faltered, the matriarch's facade crumbling. He offered me a rare smile, one that held a lifetime of unspoken affection. "Come on, Ella. Let's go home." As we left the house, I realized that for the first time I was seeing my father not just as a stern Marine, but as a protector, an ally, and a parent whose love was as unyielding as the steel he used to break my chains. The door to my old room swung open, the familiar scent of lavender and old books greeting me like an embrace. Dad had insisted I stay with him for a few days, and although I felt like a teenager returning to her childhood sanctuary, it was a refuge I found myself grateful for. "Ella, do you need anything?" Dad's voice was gentle, a contrast to the Marine's bark I grew up with. I shook my head, sinking onto the quilted bedspread. "Just some peace, I think." He nodded, the lines in his face softening. "You've got plenty of that here," he assured me before retreating, leaving the door slightly ajar. I let out a long, trembling breath, the events of the past days cascading through my mind. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, breaking the silence. It was Alex. Ella, I'm so sorry. I've just landed and heard what happened. Are you okay? His voice was fraught with worry. I will be, I replied, the words heavy on my tongue. We need to talk, Alex. About everything. There was a pause, and I could picture him running a hand through his hair in exasperation. I know. This has gone too far. Mom, she's out of control. It's not just your mom, I said, my voice steady, despite the turmoil inside. It's us, too. We let it get this far. We need to set some boundaries. Alex sighed, a sound of resignation and agreement. You're right. When you're ready, we'll sit down together. With Mom, too, if you're willing. I considered his words, the seed of a new beginning taking root amidst the wreckage. We'll see, I murmured. Let's start with us first. The conversation with Alex was a promise, a tentative step toward a future where I was no longer a prisoner of someone else's making. As I lay back, staring at the ceiling fan's lazy rotations, I pondered the enormity of the change that was to come. That night, dinner with Dad was a quiet affair, the clinking of cutlery punctuating the silence. Ella, Dad finally broke the stillness, what will you do now? I met his gaze, finding an unexpected kinship in his blue eyes. I'm going to stand up for myself, Dad. And I'm going to make sure this never happens again. He nodded, a flicker of pride in his eyes. Good. Remember, you're a Thompson. We don't back down. A smile tugged at my lips. I remember. We ate in silence, but it was a comfortable one, filled with the understanding that some conversations needed no words. The aftermath of my ordeal was not just about confronting Mrs. Whitaker or redefining my marriage, it was about reclaiming my voice and my place in a family that would now have to respect my boundaries. As the evening waned and Dad retreated to his den, I was left with my thoughts and the echo of a lock snapping open. The aftermath, I realized, was not just the debris left behind by a storm, but the clarity that comes after. And in that clarity, I found a strength I never knew I possessed. The morning after my liberation was bright, the kind of luminous morning that felt like the world itself had been reborn. I sat at the kitchen table, cradling a mug of coffee as the sunlight played across the wooden surface, creating a mosaic of light and shadow. Alex had returned home late last night, his face etched with concern and disbelief as I recounted the events of the weekend. The air between us was now thick with unsaid words, a mixture of his guilt and my own shaken trust. Ella, Alex began, breaking the silence. His voice was hesitant, fragile. I'm so sorry. I never thought. Thought what, Alex? That your mother would actually imprison me? Or that you'd let her dictate our lives to this extent? My words were not angry, just tired. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of exasperation and defeat. I know. It's just, she's always been this force in my life, and I haven't? I interjected, not to wound, but to understand. He looked up, his eyes meeting mine. No, it's not that. You are my life, Ella. I just don't know how to balance the two. I sighed, a long, deep breath that felt like it carried the weight of the past days with it. Alex, your mother's balance is her having control. That's not balance, that's tyranny. He nodded slowly, a dawning of realization in his eyes. You're right. I've been blind to it, and to how it's affected us. But what do we do now? She's still my mother. I reached across the table, taking his hand. We set boundaries, Alex. Real ones. And we enforce them, together. Your mother needs to understand that we are a family, too. Our own family. He squeezed my hand, a symbol of accord. Together, he echoed. We spent the rest of the morning outlining what those boundaries would look like, discussing how we would approach Mrs. Whitaker, and what our non-negotiables were. It was a conversation that should have happened long ago, but the clarity it brought felt like a heralding of a new era. The doorbell rang, an unexpected chime that interrupted our planning. Alex rose to answer it, and I heard murmured voices. Before he returned, a look of surprised contentment on his face. "It's the neighbors," he said. They heard something happened and they've brought over some food. They want to make sure you're okay." I felt a surge of gratitude for the community that had quietly observed and now stepped in with such warmth. "I'd like to thank them," I said, standing up. As I walked to the door, I was greeted by the sight of Mrs. Jensen from next door, holding a casserole, and Mr. Klein from across the street with a basket of muffins. "Ella, dear, we just wanted to make sure you're all right," Mrs. Jensen said, her eyes reflecting a motherly concern. I smiled, feeling the genuineness of the community's support. "Thank you, both of you. It means a lot to me. We look out for each other around here," Mr. Klein chimed in. "And if you ever need anything, you just holler." Their kindness was a balm, and as they left, I turned to Alex. "See? This is what family can be. Supportive, not suffocating." He nodded, a smile playing on his lips. "A new dawn," he said softly. "Yes," I agreed, feeling the weight lifting off my chest. A new dawn indeed. It was a week since the incident, and the leaves outside whispered of change. I stood by the window, watching the world go by, feeling a sense of calm that had eluded me for so long. The sunlight was a gentle touch, the breeze a quiet conversation. It was in this moment of peace that I heard the door open behind me. "Ella," Alex called out, a softness in his voice that seemed to tread lightly, as if over a new ground. I turned to see him holding an envelope. The cream color of it seemed stark against his uncertain hands. "What's that?" I asked, moving towards him. "It's from my mother," he said, and his voice held a tremor of the old fear, the ingrained obedience. But there was something else there too, a note of defiance, perhaps. I took the envelope, the paper crisp and oddly formal in my hands. "Are you going to open it?" Alex asked, watching me closely. I nodded, and as I slid my finger under the seal, I felt the weight of what this letter might hold. It could be an apology, a condemnation, or another attempt at control. I unfolded the paper, and Alex and I read Mrs. Whitaker's neat script together. "Ella and Alex," it began. "I've had time to reflect on the events that transpired, and I find myself at a crossroads." I looked at Alex, his eyes scanning the lines rapidly. "She's apologizing," he murmured, disbelief etching his features. I continued reading aloud. "I understand now that my actions were out of line. I cannot undo what I've done, but I can give you the space you both deserve to make your own choices." The letter ended with an offer to sit down and discuss how we could move forward, as a family, but with respect for our autonomy. I folded the letter, feeling an unexpected surge of relief. "She's giving us a choice," I said, and there was power in that realization, the power to choose how and when to engage. Alex nodded, a slow smile spreading across his face. "It's what you've always said, isn't it? That we have the choice. We're not under her command." I smiled back, and it felt like the final piece of a puzzle clicking into place. "Yes, and we choose to be kind, but also to be firm. We decide what our family looks like." "So, what do we do?" Alex asked, the old hesitance now a shadow of what it once was. "We accept her offer," I replied, "but on our terms. We meet in a neutral place, we express our feelings, and we listen. We build something new, something healthier." He took my hand, his grip strong and sure. "Together," he affirmed, and I felt the strength that came from that unity. "Together," I echoed, feeling the truth of it deep in my bones. The decision was made. We would meet with Mrs. Whitaker, but the dynamics had irrevocably shifted. The power of choice was ours, and with it, the future opened up like the sky at dawn, vast, bright, and infinite in its possibilities.